We'll wrap up potassium, talking about potassium sources and fertilizers that are commonly used for potassium. So, potassium fertilizer and potash are often used interchangeably. Potassium fertilizer or potash is K2O, so this idea of this potassium oxide is how the fertilizer industry reports potassium concentrations in fertilizer, not elemental K. So again, think back to something like triple 13, it's 13% nitrogen, elemental nitrogen, 13% P2O5, and 13% K2O. We can convert between elemental K and K2O by either multiplying or dividing by 0.3 or multiplying and dividing by the inverse of 1.2. So if we have K2O and we want to get to elemental K, we multiply by 0.83 because we've got to just essentially take this oxygen out of the picture for every two potassiums. And likewise, we have to multiply by 1.2 if we're going from K2O to K. So an example would be 10 pounds of 0060. Again, this is 0.6% concentration, so we would multiply 10 by 0.6, and that would give us the concentration of K2O. If we wanted to go to elemental K, we'd have to multiply that by 0.83, and we get essentially 5 pounds of elemental K. Okay, so in other words, we can just say 0060, which is really the most common potassium fertilizer, is roughly, for every 1 pound, it's a half a pound of elemental potassium. Okay, so anyways, a bit annoying, but just something to be aware of in terms of how the fertilizer industry labels and markets these types of things. Potassium fertilizers, this is a bit of a confusing graph because it's got world and U.S. sources, but this is world use of KCl, potassium chloride, and then these boxes are U.S. use of KCl, and then the other circles down here are world use of other potassium fertilizers and U.S. use of other potassium fertilizers. So we can see that the vast majority of potassium fertilizer or potash is actually potassium chloride. It's KCl. That's really what most everyone uses. Certainly not the only thing, but it's by far the most common fertilizer. Okay, there's lots of different types of potassium fertilizer, like this kind of terrible table shows you, and they can be in inorganic form or the organic form. Okay, there's lots of references to go try to find potassium fertilizer out there. So potash, KCl, different types. We've got red or white. We've got potassium sulfate with magnesium sulfate, potassium nitrate, and there's potassium phosphates, carbonate sulfates, and these can all be straight potassium or blended with other nutrients as well. Okay. So why the word potash? So I just mentioned that potash historically or is used synonymously with potassium fertilizer, and that's just kind of something that's stuck around. I don't know why, but it just has. So it used to be potash was manufactured a few hundred years ago from taking wood ash, actually ashes from a fireplace or from a fire pit, and they would leach it in large iron pots. Okay, they would use different types of soaps or other additives, and they would leach this potassium from essentially that ash, and that would become potash. So it was the potassium from ash, and that was used as fertilizer source. This is really not done anymore. It's not practiced, in any kind of scale. Maybe besides Renaissance fairs or something like that. But what we really do now is we mine. How we get potash is we mine marine salts. We mine large deposits, marine salts that were put down over long periods of time, thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, maybe millions of years. and these are inland seas that have evaporated over time. Um, things like Great Salt Lake and Dead Sea, in many years, many years from now, might be mined for potassium chloride. Although we won't be around to witness that. So, late 1800s, mineral deposits of potash were discovered in Germany. But as mining exploration occurred and people understood what they were dealing with, 1920, some in California, Nevada, and New Mexico. But really today the largest deposits are in Canada and Russia, primarily a little bit in Belarus as well. So here's a bit of a pixelated map showing you where the potash reserves are. Okay, and so this is really every time you talk about reserves, like the known potash reserves. So nearly all of our potash, all of our KCl comes from Canada, and primarily most of it comes from Saskatchewan. Okay, so Russia feeds a lot of Europe and Asia in terms of feeding them with potassium fertilizer, but there's different pockets. But again, in the United States, Canada is the primary source, and these are just. I've never had the opportunity to go on one of these tours, but I've been told about them, and it's apparently just pretty wild, where you go down in these mine shafts that are like very, very deep, like thousands of feet deep, and they're just operators down there that are essentially grinding rock up into little chunks and then taking it away, taking it to the surface, and then that gets loaded on tanker carts, and those get shipped to processing facilities. Okay, so depending on the type of rock and where it's from, there's sometimes a red hint to it. That's typically the potash that I see. It often has these kind of like iron impurities that are these give it a reddish kind of hue, but it's at the simplest level. It's just taking rock, grinding it up, and then applying that as fertilizer. Okay, so there's very little processing that actually occurs here. You take that and compare that to something like phosphorus, which takes a lot of processing, kind of very sophisticated processing and acidification to make that a soluble nutrient. Potassium is a lot different in that regard. So potassium fertilizer, KCl, MOP or muriate of potash. Sometimes internationally you'll see bags of fertilizer labeled as MOP, muriate of potash. Okay, so it's all really the same stuff. It's the most common fertilizer worldwide. It's readily dissolves in water. But for every one chloride ion, you get one. For every one potassium ion, you get one chloride ion. And chloride, of course, can cause issues in excess. And so this can be really problematic in arid environments. And so a lot of times in arid environments, we don't have a lot of fertilizer or a lot of productivity that occurs, but if you are in an arid environment, chloride might be a very real issue, and you don't want to be adding chloride to increase your salt level anymore to make saline soils, and so other sources are available for that. And things like potassium sulfate, K2SO4. Okay, so this is about roughly 50% K2O, 52. Also contains sulfur, so when we are needing sulfur or wanting chloride minimized, then this would be a good fertility source. This is more expensive than potassium chloride, but it's this is something that you can find pretty widely available. Good for crops that are sensitive to chlorine or fertilizer burn, things like tobacco and pineapple and avocado. Some of those grown here, some not so much. But K2SO4 is a little bit less soluble than potassium chloride, so we often won't see this, mixing in, say, a liquid fertilizer or blended in a liquid form. Potassium mag sulfate. These can again mined through various processes, but it's going to these kind of underground mines that used to be ancient ocean beds and mining these salts out. 18% potassium, 11% magnesium, 22% sulfur on average. Typically used in higher value crops, again, more expensive and less soluble than KCl. Potassium nitrate, or sometimes called nitrate of potash or saltpeter. This is often, say, there's nitrate in here, so it's nitrate, and then potassium nitrate being that negative ion, potassium, 13044. This is very water soluble. It's chloride free and supplies nitrogen. Can be used very well in kind of a fertigation system, things like orchards and vegetables that are running, say, drip irrigation or some sort of fertigation. This is like the same stuff that they use in fireworks, for firework displays. So pretty interesting, but can come as powder or crystalline form, and then can be prilled as well. So a number of different forms. So this is a popular fertilizer. USDA organic potassium fertilizers are things that we would call OMRI certified, the organic material list that's available. We'll talk a little bit about that later. Of course, any kind of manure or compost or biosolid, things like this that are in the organic form often contain fertilizer. Lots of manures actually, manure typically contains relatively high levels of potassium, so in a field that's manured heavily or has a history of manure, we often find very elevated K levels. We don't think that's necessarily that bad of a thing, but it certainly could be if there's too much K. There's also things that are, again, certified organic that are, they're just essentially mined salts, but they're not processed or purified. Potassium magnesium sulfate or sulfate of potash, which is 0052 and 17% sulfur. So sulfate of potash is typically what you see in Ohio organic growers using for a OMRI certified product. Sometimes they'll even use green sand, which has a lot lower potassium concentration. But sulfate of potash is pretty on par in terms of concentration with KCl. Does include sulfur as well. So, and then even seaweed, not surprisingly, it's coming from the sea, so it can have decent concentration of potassium. You're not going to apply this at really high levels, but often as kind of a foliar or even an animal feed as a source of potassium. Okay, so a lot of the talk, always talking about how do we get more potassium, or more fertilizer, and then thinking about on the other side of an over-application. Potassium is, not really a threat to water quality, so we don't think of it in the same context of N and P in terms of over-application. But certainly, over-application can really, limit farmer profitability in terms of just buying these nutrients excessively and not really needing them, right? So that's not a good return on investment if over-application continues to occur, right? But there can be, particularly in ruminants, luxury consumption by plants. That is, plants take up, more nutrient than they actually need to complete their function, and that can have very real and serious consequences in cattle. And so, if you're grazing, you're very sensitive to this idea of grass tetany. This is the idea that potassium is over-applied, and then magnesium is under absorbed. It's essentially that because there's a lot of potassium there, magnesium does not get into the plant in sufficient concentrations in that forage. The ruminant eats that forage and then has essentially a magnesium deficiency that's formed. So the idea that, especially, and we'll talk more about this when we get into calcium and magnesium in a couple weeks, but potassium, calcium, magnesium, these base saturations, these base cations we've already talked about, they all interact and can compete, and sometimes in a negative way, for plant uptake. So we have to be sensitive to this. We can't just go out and dump, potassium on because of the implications that it has with magnesium nutrition and calcium nutrition as well. Okay, so there it is, potassium fertilizer sources, and it's relatively simple in terms of kind of the gamut that's out there. When we think about phosphorus and nitrogen, we have typically a lot more options than with potassium, which is, again, for the most part, it's going to be just a handful of different fertilizers that we use, at least in the conventional setting. Potassium chloride, potassium sulfate, potassium nitrate. All right, I'll wrap up there.